China is a sleeping lion, and when she awakes, the world will shake. China is today not just woken up. China has stood up, and China is on the march, and the question for us all is, where will China go, and how do we engage this giant of the 21st century? If you start looking at the numbers, they start to confront you in a big way. It's projected that China will become, by whichever measure, PPP, market exchange rates, the largest economy in the world over the course of the decade ahead. They're already the largest trading nation, already the largest exporting nation, already the largest manufacturing nation, and they're also the biggest emitters of carbon in the world.
You once said that there's always something new to learn about China. What's your latest new thoughts on China?
I think my latest new thoughts on China is to see more and more evidence of China's self-confidence in the world. You read books about it and you read articles about it, but if you know as many Chinese people as I do, 比较多，不就是在网络是直接的，接触，他们对那个全世界的自信 ，self-confidence，越来越大。And I see this in people's individual behavior, their corporate behavior, the political behavior of the Chinese government and state. So I think what I see most is this growing self-confidence as China, having opened the doors in 1978, having reformed the economy through the 80s and 90s, and then having 走出去 after that, and then 10 or 15 years after 走出去, there is a increasing level of maturity about China's understanding of the world. It's not perfect, but what I see is a greater, more mature reflection of what the world is like, and a greater sense of comfort in working in the world. Like in your job, you wouldn't be doing this in New York 20 years ago, would you?
True.
Okay, so you're an example of this.
But what do you think the confidence come from? Because for a long time, Western scholars always think that Chinese people regard themselves as a victim instead of very competent in the world stage.
I think...
is it because of economy or culture or something else?
Well, I think one of the good things about Chinese culture is you have this whole emphasis on 谦虚, modesty and humility. This is not often the biggest strength in the United States. You know that, I know that, and hopefully the Americans won't hear this, so that'll be fine. But the great advantage that China has, I think there is an instinctive modesty about the culture and about behavior, and deferring to people. I think this is a good thing. Secondly, I think that is a good skill for understanding the world. If you go out into the world and your attitude is purely 100% 自大, that doesn't help understand the world. You just create enemies that way. And so I think learning to take your time and to patiently understand the world is a very fruitful exercise, although it takes time. The third thing is just a very practical thing, which is the doors were shut for a long time, and then they opened. And now tens of millions of Chinese have gone out into the world. Probably now hundreds of millions, I'm not sure, either short-term or long-term. So the world is less of a mystery to the people of China. And then, of course, there's the point that you referred to, which is that China is now wealthier and as a country more powerful. The Chinese reformers of the late Qing dynasty dreamt of wealth and power. If you look at the traditional reformers of Yan Fu and Tan Tong and Liang Qichao, and that whole period, even Kang Youwei, in the 1890s, prior to the Xinhai Geming, they always dreamt of how China could obtain wealth and power to deal with the young ren, Yapian Zhanzheng Dengdeng. So that was in the 1890s. 100 years later, wealth and power has arrived. And so I think Chinese people sense that, and that also enables them to be more confident in the world. Even though, as you know and I know, China still has stacks of problems. Chinese leadership knows that as well.
You travel to China a lot of times, and now you live in New York, so you know China, you know U.S. very well. In the past, we have a lot of like people who work on the China-U.S. relationship very well, like Dr. Kissinger, like Mr. Paulson. What did you learn from their experience?
I think with Henry Kissinger, who I know very well, what Henry has concluded a long time ago is, first, a country as old as China does not change its fundamental views of the world quickly or easily. I mean, you've had a philosophical system and a system of language which is now, 4,000 years old, 3,000 to 4,000 years old. And so, as a result, you have a deeply entrenched view of the world and a view of yourself. There are no other countries like that. There are no other countries which are big modern countries which are simultaneously ancient countries. Perhaps Iran or Persia comes closest in terms of continuity. So that's the one thing which Henry emphasizes. I think the second thing is if you're going to try and help US-China relations, it's best to do it quietly. It's a very good principle. It's very easy in politics and in international relations to 说大话。说大话很容易，但是最困难的一件事就是解决好具体的问题。后来不说。That, I think, is a very clever approach from Henry. As for Hank, who I know as well, and so he has had a different perspective to Henry's, who has always been a foreign policy, national security guy. But what Hank has seen is the evolution of the Chinese entrepreneurial mind. And so he is constantly encouraged by what China has achieved in its economy. And so I listen to both of them a lot, and I'm privileged to count both of them as friends.
Just now you mentioned Paulson's difference from Dr. Kissinger. What's your difference from them two?
I'm an Australian. That's a pretty obvious difference. And I have no illusions about my importance in the world. At the end of the day, I am a former Prime Minister of one G20 country. These guys were respectively Secretary of State and Secretary of the Treasury for the largest country in the world. And so these guys carry a lot of influence. So I don't see myself in their league at all.
You once joked about Australians are good at bring the drinks. You provide a suggestion, go and get a drink. Just as you mentioned, China has a long history, and the U.S. is the most powerful country in the world. So how do you make sure that your suggestions are more likely to be taken and more operational?
Well, at the end of the day, you can't guarantee that, because governments are governments. I have run my own government in the past, and governments ultimately make up their own minds. I think the key to successfully advising a government is to explain carefully your understanding of the interests of China and the interests of the United States. The interests of China as seen through Chinese eyes, but interestingly, the interests of China as seen through American eyes. And sometimes they're not the same thing. And by the same logic, it's important to explain to the Chinese American interests as the Americans see them. So I think half the battle is in removing this problem of perceptions. Some of them are objective difficulties, where it's not a problem of language and culture.
I agree with you that you are in a great place to talk to both sides in a way. But you're
Sometimes.
But you're not a Chinese, not America.
You can see it. 100%大鼻子，不算是中国人。
Have you ever come across a situation where you have like an outsider dilemma or like a trust crisis?
The outsider dilemma. Well, Australians generally have an outsider dilemma because we're the only Western country in Asia. And so we're kind of used to this outsider dilemma. Well, there's New Zealand too. But as a result, we're used to being the odd man out or the odd man in, if you know what I mean. I think the key, there's one advantage in being an Australian in Asia relative to other Westerners. And that is, in our region, the Asia-Pacific region, we recognise the fact that there are much bigger, more powerful, and certainly more ancient cultures and civilizations than ours. Therefore, that places a burden of responsibility on us to understand these other cultures, to understand China from the inside, to understand Japan from the inside, as opposed to just thinking that these are expressions of Western thinking. The West is a relatively new idea, last 500 years. Most of these cultures and civilizations have been around for 1,000, 1,500, 2,000, 2,500, 3,000 plus. So as Australians, I can't say that we are naturally Chinchu, but we understand that we are new kids on the block, and we understand that we are smaller kids on the block. So therefore we make it our business to understand great powers, whether it's the Americans or you guys. So does that give us an advantage? Sometimes. Is that an outsider's dilemma? I think it's an outsider's advantage, actually.
Let's talk about an individual case. For example, recently Donald Trump calls for China IP review, and we got the Chinese response. On this case, what do you think? What did you do? What are you going to do to help the two?
Well, the Trump presidency is unique. I haven't seen one like it. I don't think the American people have either, and probably not the Chinese people. Secondly, it's a deeply protectionist government. And they said that before they were elected. They're going to protect American industry against foreign firms, particularly Chinese firms. And since the election, they've done that. They announced the abolition of the TPP before they even started. And now they're beginning to take measures against China. So what can be done about it by people like us? The argument I always put is, never forget, all of us, how we have benefited from open trade and open investment rules. Asia, including China, 30 years ago, while not poor, was certainly not rich. The big thing that's changed it is the whole wealth that has come through open trade and investment between the countries of the region and between the region and the United States, between the region and Europe. So people often forget this, that in decades past, our part of the world was not all that prosperous. But it's prosperous now because of open lines of commerce and investment and trade, and business, and technology flows and capital flows. So that's the first thing we emphasize, which is, and the second thing we emphasize is, it's very easy to trigger a trade war, which becomes an investment war, which becomes an economic war. And once you do that, our collective wealth collapses. So what we try to do is just to emphasize these two basic truths in our dealings with the Chinese and with the Americans. Will we have an effect or not? I do not know. Because, as I said, this is a unique presidency.
So do you think protectionism or populism is only a short-term phenomenon or a beginning of a major, larger global trend?
My attitude is not one of making broad predictions, partly because I'm still, if you like, a political activist, which is I want to see changes in a positive direction. And so I believe it lies within the grasp of the Chinese government, the European governments, and the government of the United States to make the right decisions for the future, to keep economies open, to keep societies open, to keep markets open. Will they have the political resolve to do that? Well, that's the reason Macron was elected. And that's a reason why the far-right parties in the Netherlands were not elected. And that's why the far-right parties, even in Britain at the last general election, failed. In the United Kingdom Independence Party, UKIP. So you see, it's not just one trend towards protectionism. It's a very mixed trend. If you look at the opinion polling in Europe, it's fascinating. 77% of Europeans want to remain within the European Union. No, 77. 77%，那是比较多嘛。And so the whole idea that concerns about cultural identity and protecting your culture equals closing the doors to global trade and investment is a false equation. In Europe, if you look at the opinion poll data carefully, 那是民意调查很清楚呢，一部分的那些因素都是我要保护我本人的我本地区的文化，与此同时呢，不一定等于保护我们的经济，或者采取那个保护主义方面的那个贸易措施。So it's a complex question. I think if policymakers can recognize the difference, we can protect our cultures, that's fine. But understand that our collective wealth lies still with a globalizing economy.
The future of US-China relations, the head says there's a way forward. The head says there is a policy framework, there's a common narrative, there's a mechanism through regular summitry to do these things and to make them better. But the heart must also find a way to reimagine the possibilities of the America-China relationship and the possibilities of China's future engagement in the world. Sometimes, folks, we just need to take a leap of faith, not quite knowing where we might land.
Is that your mission or your core value?
No, I think if I've got a core mission or a core value, it's how can you bring about a set of circumstances where political leaders around the world change their thinking about the inevitability of conflict. Because in the back of the mind of most political leaders is a view that history teaches us that conflict is inevitable. So how can you change that? And that for me is a question of deep national psychology. So my mission is how do you explain at a practical level how you can avoid conflict, but also through the evolution of what I describe as common values, which transcend all civilizational traditions, all religious traditions, which reminds us that we're just all human beings. By the way, if you cut that, I believe the same as you. 就是人类梦。
很多人就认为我们做富豪榜，我们看富豪，其实我们不怎么看，我看故事。
我有一个发现，我觉得非常好玩的。如果你看10几年前，中国大教育行业的首富教英文的，就是俞敏洪。因为很多人就是想在跨国公司去工作了，要做世界的，觉得没有英文的可能就不好发展了，所以大家都要学英文。然后就不久之后，大概5年前，中国的教育首富已经不是俞敏洪，是被那个税尔斯超越了。然后他做什么？他就是帮你小孩进好一点的学校。就这么简单。然后呢，直到大概2年前，张邦鑫也被超越了。被谁超越了？帮你找工作，找什么工作了？
是什么呢？
公务员培训。那个人就是李永信，好像也是被他别了。然后通过这些故事，你可以了解一个趋势的。所以，但是现在都要找工作了，能找公务员那就是最好的。It's an amazing story。确实就这样子。那就回到2000年前了，还是1000年前唐朝、宋朝的时候，那个时候你要
考 exam，
你要那个考得上，那你的生命就变了。
对，
就是可以看到一个这个教育的需求在哪里啊。然后从教育的需求，确实可以对中国的经济可以有一点新的理解。
所以这个也看到这种菜 gas 的变化。
从yes， 绝对是的。因为我们讲的是人，人能上去的，肯定是才改成功。对，但是这个完全就改变了，
变了是吧？
但是那个友谊方面应该是在这里吧？
啊，
友谊，
那是友谊宾馆，那个是友谊。
那个就是嘛。
对，那就是。
对，我当过那个友谊宾馆的第一个广告。他们有一次请我们留学生到他那里吃饭，然后我们可以免费吃饭，然后到最后他们就拍了很多照片，一天。我应该给你找出来。当时那个广告，而且用了大概是20年。我不知道现在还有没有，我不清楚的。就是我和我的一个同学的，我们俩在吃饭，像给人感觉就 very 高大上。我大概前年还是去年回来了，然后我带我太太和孩子们到人大，但是我几乎认不出来了。我特别喜欢站在因为我们的那个留学生楼当时是海淀区最高的一个楼，可以看得很远的，现在应该是这边的最矮的楼之一吧。当时我特别喜欢站在那个楼顶，拿2个凳子上去了，跟我们同学的去聊天。
你们在一起聊什么呢？会talking about future or
当时是那个第一次伊拉克战争的时候，然后都比较有好奇的。This big country, what is it doing? 然后，所以我是下午不参加课，我就下午做了一个 part-time job。
是做什么？
玄武公园。
宣武公园做什么？
有一个地方，有一个办公室做，就是在中国第一个 PR 公司的。那个时候的公关的概念，就是一个很负面的意思的，
对，
基本上是那些卡拉 OK 里面的小姐做公关的那个时候的，就没有一个公关概念的，
对
PR，
对，
然后就没有收到1分钱，但是比较开心，因为确实可以有更多的交流。
但那时候会有感觉，作为一个 foreign student 会有那种 privilege 那种感觉强。
我们感觉非常有钱的，虽然不是有钱人，但是我记得我北大的一个朋友的，他就可能1年你就这么几十块钱可以花了。我每一次是我请他鱼香肉丝、宫保鸡丁，
对，
差距还是挺大的。
现在中国留学生，他们很多有钱人立刻就买了房子去读书。
但现在我应该是完全倒过来了。
对，totally change。
哦，你找到了那本书，厉害厉害。
我是这一年做记者，做商业记者的，所以
这个好久没看过。02年，你看。
对，02年。
你看，我记得很多。孙光新，我记得他当时我去了新疆，他给我印象特别深刻的。因为他是一个军人出身。然后军人出来以后，因为那边汉族比较少，但是爱吃鱼，但是乌鲁木齐离海比较远的，
对，没有，
所以开了一个鱼餐厅，然后开的比较成功，然后后来俄罗斯苏联，就出问题了，91年，然后在那边就是买了一些石油的装备，然后又完全改了。然后就变成房地产，然后就很好玩。
就 surfer， 他不断的有浪
抓机会，很快，确实厉害的不得了。
你记得那个时候中国社会的气氛是什么呢？对钱是什么态度呢？是一个
钱怎么态度的？最起码就是没有今天这种财富透明度。比如说我，这个人我记得，许荣茂。我当时我在。上海看到有一个广告，世贸滨江就是在上海很有名的一个楼盘，它的广告叫68888888，然后我印象很深刻的，我就说， 谁能买得起这个电话号码，应该是可以上榜。所以，然后我找到了，我就是打电话过去了。然后呢，打电话过去以后，发现找不到他们这里的，但是知道是一个福建的老板，给他们福建的总部打电话。终于发榜的前2天就找到了他们了，他好像排到前10名了。印象也蛮深刻的。陈丽华就女首富了。
对。
全球白手起家女首富，这个是后来才知道的，这是很好玩的，很多好玩的东西，很多好玩的东西。
你当时想过中国企业家的这种对你们的这种信任也好，或者不信任也好，最初做榜单困难点是什么呢？现在想起来，
我是多年来很多人就跟我讲，哎呀，我们中国人不爱露富，好吧，我就说了，好吧，那你因为我不认为这是一个中国特色，我这是全球差不多的吧。当然我说，那你怎么帮我解决的？全球买高档汽车买的最多的是在哪儿？在这儿。全球买那个高档手表最多的是在哪儿？在这儿。全球买最多的高档红酒、白酒在哪儿？都是在这儿。确实是有心理矛盾。我这个心理矛盾我是这样子理解的。你自己还是很自豪。因为你再怎么样，你是万分之一的还是100万分之一的成功？其实是相当的 lucky， 不容易，所以这块儿你应该特别的自豪。其实你会到全球，基本上没有一个人愿意把他的财富放在阳光之下，但是他认为放在阳光之下可以帮他放大，所以才愿意上市的。我今天发了榜，有一个人就说我不愿意上榜，你把名字拿掉。我说没办法，你是上市公司的。谁都能估算你的股份，你的股份就这个企业的20%几，这个企业值100块钱，你就22块钱，我就，你懂意思吗？就你在公开场地，你就可以把自己放大，但是同样你要有这个眼光。
我觉得中国的环境可能更复杂一点吧。
我不认为。
你不认为啊？
我不认为。因为我自己学了历史的。这跟历史有关系的。我记得我有一次我在海淀那边的，就是往那个友谊宾馆走路的时候，就是我跟一个同学，一个中国人在一起，然后我们看了一个高档车，我说你以后你应该开个它，我是给他开玩笑的，其实我就没说什么，然后他很严肃的回头对我说 no，我不会的。我说为什么？因为那些车都是绿的、蓝的、白的，绿的是跟军队有关的，蓝的是跟海关有关的，白的是跟什么务工还是这种东西有关的，这是国家的。所以作为一个老百姓，我不可能做一个开这么一个车的，而且我本来工作都是分配出去的，所以是不可能的。
对，那个时候大家不愿意谈论金钱的，包括对钱也觉得跟自己没有那么多的关系，他的人生就会很固定的上班。
但是真的是在92年就开始了，这个气氛完全不一样的。actually 真的是很好玩的。我听到了新疆人就跟我讲，在新疆创业者的都跟我讲，他们会坐火车到深圳去买什么电子产品啊，然后把它带回那边，然后那边就是买高价，西安的、成都的。当然，上海的、北京都在跟我说，然后就是第一桶金就是慢慢从这里就来了。
深圳就像我们的中国的 The West 西部一样 ，Gold Rush 去。
It was a gold rush. It's kind of interesting. But 这些故事我觉得挺值得说，挺值得记录。
那如果从第一份榜单到现在这个20年，如果划分这些企业家或者说不同的阶段的话，你觉得能分成哪几个阶段呢？
第一批是做贸易的，然后第二批是做海南，然后第三批可能做房地产，然后第四批可能就是开始做制造业的和出口，早年的网络，等等这方面，走到今天的是这几个阶段的。我的深刻的一种感觉的是这样子的，就是如果我们要写企业家历史，这帮企业家肯定会超过了第一批洛克菲勒、摩根、卡耐基的企业家的，他们的规模其实会做的有可能还要大了，因为目前还年龄也不是特别大了。然后我另外一个深度感受得到，你现在到大学生去接触这些4年级啊、3年级的，很多人就是有个创业梦想， 然后就觉得哎，说不定我也可以成那个下一个喜茶的聂允成，才29岁45亿的，